All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're tracking the dramatic rise, that breathtaking cultural zenith, and the absolutely spectacular collapse of the Mughal Empire. I mean, this is a story of incredible vision and profound cultural synthesis, but also ultimately a tragic systemic failure that totally redrew the map of India. We aren't just going to list off a timeline of emperors here. We're going to examine the actual administrative mechanics and the philosophical choices that built this empire, and then dig into the fatal blunders that tore the whole thing down.
So to help us navigate hundreds of years of history, we've broken this down into 6 parts. Forging the Mughal Empire, Akbar's House of Worship, the Din-e-Ilahi debate, Aurangzeb and the Deccan Ulcer, the anatomy of an empire's fall, and lastly, theories of Mughal decline.
Starting off with Section 1, Forging the Mughal Empire. Let's look at governance and culture.
To get our bearings, this story spans from Babur's initial conquest of Delhi in 1526 at the Battle of Panipat, all the way down to the pivotal death of Aurangzeb in 1707. These 4 dates are really the critical pillars holding up the entire Mughal era. We go from the initial establishment straight into a golden age of rapid expansion and cultural flourishing, and then we plunge into rapid disintegration. But to understand how this massive structure was actually held together, we really have to look past the battlefield.
Because, Babur didn't just conquer, he laid down a really robust governance framework and kicked off a rich cultural tapestry of arts and those iconic gardens. But to maintain a conquest of that size, you need systems. The Mughals implemented the Mansabdari system. Think of it as a super sophisticated civil and military bureaucracy where nobles were given specific ranks and responsibilities. And when you couple that with the Zabt system for land revenue, it created a highly centralized state. It wasn't just about swords and cavalry, right? It was about brilliant strategic administrative innovations that allowed the central government to harness the vast wealth of the entire Indian subcontinent.
Which brings us to Section 2, Akbar's House of Worship, the Zenith of Synthesis. Just think about the 16th century for a second. In an age when religious persecution was pretty much the global standard, Akbar was hosting a vibrant parliament of religions. He invited scholars from literally every major faith, Sunni, Shia, Hindu, Jain, Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish, all of them, to the Ibadat Khana, or House of Worship, to engage in these profound theological debates. He didn't just tolerate different viewpoints, he actively sought them out. He really wanted to understand the universal truths hidden within all these traditions. This wasn't just idle curiosity, it was a concerted, deliberate effort to intellectually unite a deeply diverse empire.
And he didn't just talk the talk. Akbar translated these philosophical discussions into an eclectic, tolerant state policy that welcomed indigenous elements directly into the imperial fold. By adopting a solar-era calendar, celebrating festivals from various faiths, and passing non-killing regulations that were heavily influenced by Jain and Buddhist teachings, he wove the cultural fabric of his subjects right into the identity of the Mughal court. He understood a crucial lesson for governing diverse societies. You just cannot rule a vast empire exclusively by the cultural norms of a minority elite.
Moving on to Section 3, the Din-e-Ilahi debate. Was it heresy or cultural synthesis? Now this is where history gets fiercely debated. For a really long time, the dominant narrative, which was pushed by contemporary Orthodox critics and later amplified by some European historians, was that Akbar effectively renounced Islam. They claimed he created a brand new religion purely out of immense hubris, basically positioning himself as a deity. But modern research paints a very different picture. Instead of an egomaniacal cult, a lot of scholars now interpret the Din-e-Ilahi as more of a Sufi-inspired order. It was a spiritual brotherhood aimed at binding the nobility together and promoting cultural synthesis, while Akbar himself stayed fundamentally within the fold of Islam.
Early Western historians viewed Akbar's actions through a really critical, almost hostile lens. Take Vincent Smith, for example. He literally claimed the whole scheme was the outcome of a ridiculous vanity, a monstrous growth of unrestrained autocracy. Opinions like that often relied heavily on the prejudiced accounts of disgruntled courtiers like Mullah Badauni, or even European Jesuit missionaries who were just frustrated that they couldn't convert Akbar to Christianity. It is a stark reminder of how the personal biases of chroniclers can dramatically shape our understanding of historical events centuries later.
All right, pivoting to Section 4, Aurangzeb and the Deccan Ulcer. This is the turning point.
When you look at the sheer scale of the borders during Aurangzeb's reign, the empire bloated to a size that was frankly impossible to control effectively from Delhi. His relentless drive to conquer the Deccan Plateau in the south pushed the borders to their absolute maximum extent, but this massive territorial expansion, it was a total double-edged sword. The geographical reality of ruling a landmass this massive, especially with 17th century communication technology, meant that the further the borders pushed outward, the weaker the central authority became.
In stark contrast to Akbar, Aurangzeb completely reversed policies of religious tolerance. Plus, he made the massive political blunder of destroying the Deccan kingdoms, which essentially removed the vital buffer between the Mughals and the fiercely resistant Marathas. By reimposing the jizya tax, he alienated the Rajput chieftains who had been the most loyal pillars of the Mughal military for generations. The results? By spending over 2 decades in the south destroying the Shia kingdoms of Bijapur and Golconda, he inadvertently unleashed the Marathas, sparking a brutal, grinding conflict that would slowly bleed his entire reign dry.
Let's break that down in Section 5, Anatomy of an Empire's Fall, the Chain of Ruin. It's basically a devastating domino effect. You've got military overstretch directly leading to economic bankruptcy, which then leads to military demoralization. This is a classic textbook lesson in the limits of imperial power. The endless Deccan Wars drained the treasury completely, and an empty treasury meant that this vast, complex army could no longer be paid reliably. Well, an unpaid army rapidly loses discipline and morale, meaning the emperor suddenly lacked the actual physical force required to collect taxes and maintain order. The administrative system, the very Mansabdari and Jaghir systems that Babur and Akbar built, was plunged into absolute chaos.
The physical and economic toll of this Deccan ulcer resulted in the loss of thousands of elite soldiers and the total ruin of the emperor's prestige. Contemporary accounts report that the mighty Mughal administration essentially ground to a halt. Officers began just keeping the tax revenues for themselves instead of sending them to the capital. And without a strong, paid central army, the emperor was utterly powerless to stop them. The social fabric of the military aristocracy began tearing itself apart from the inside out.
Finally, Section 6, Theories of Mughal Decline. Time for a historical autopsy.
The decline of this empire was highly complex, and scholars still fiercely debate the primary cause. Satish Chandra points to the institutional breakdown of the Jaghir system. Rafano Beeb argues it was actually an agrarian crisis driven by brutal overtaxation that sparked massive peasant revolts. Muzaffar Alam takes a region-centric approach, showing how local elites just sort of outgrew the central authority. And early historians like Jadunath Sarkar blame the deteriorating moral character and religious fanaticism of the emperors themselves. The reality, it's likely a really potent, toxic combination of all these factors acting together at once.
But this Jagirdari crisis is absolutely central to understanding the collapse of Aurangzeb's wars. The available social surplus simply could not fund the astronomical cost of Aurangzeb's wars while maintaining the aristocracy's lavish lifestyle. To pay the huge influx of new nobles brought in during those southern conquests, the empire needed to grant them land, known as joggers, but there simply wasn't enough profitable land, or paibaki, left to hand out. This sparked a ruthless, cutthroat competition among the nobility. Instead of fighting the empire's enemies, the elites were fighting each other for resources, completely fracturing the administrative spine of the empire.
And if all that internal rot wasn't bad enough, you compound it with weak successors, brutal foreign invasions, and ambitious regional governors who simply broke away from the withered trunk of Delhi. The Mughals never actually established a clear rule for succession, meaning every single time an emperor died, an incredibly destructive civil war erupted between his sons. While they fought amongst themselves, foreign invaders like Nadir Shah swept in, looting the capital of its remaining wealth, and powerful regional governors in places like Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad quietly just stopped taking orders, transforming themselves into independent kingdoms. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a huge question to chew on regarding the delicate balance of power, governance, and culture. Was the empire simply a victim of geography and overexpansion, inevitably crushed under its own administrative weight? Or did the conscious decision to abandon the cultural synthesis and religious tolerance pioneered by Akbar fatally alienate the very people who built the empire in the first place? The answers offer profound lessons not just for historians, but really for anyone seeking to understand the rise and fall of complex, diverse systems today. Think on that and keep exploring.